Well, we're all the way up to video 13 now in this Helm mini course. Well done if you've come through all 13 parts. We're kind of in the middle now of writing our own Helm templates. And you can get an awful lot done with what we've learned already, the functions and pipelines. When you want to get a bit more advanced though, you will need some kind of flow control in your templates. I'm talking here about ifs, thens and elses, that kind of thing. Let's have a look at how to do that in this video. I admit that in the previous videos, I was having to invent requirements really. The structure that we can see here where we've defaulted a good value for this Docker repo name and we're passing it through the lowercase function to make sure it's in the correct format. You don't really need to do that in practice because we're in control of the values.yaml file. So we can ensure that there is a value in there and it's of the correct format. So just to be clear, I am kind of deliberately pushing things here just to give us an excuse to learn about functions and pipelines. However, the one big thing that is still a requirement and we absolutely do have to achieve is this requirement of being able to switch from a development image to a production image by being able to set a simple value. Now remember, we are working on a very cut down chart here. In practice, this development and production could appear in hundreds of different places in the chart. So it's definitely something we want to extract out and to put into the values.yaml file. But I think based on what we've learned so far, we don't quite have enough information. And the reason for that is just really the way that I've structured the tag here. Now you've got to remember all the way back to the early parts of this section of the course that the idea is if we are in development, then we're using a tag that ends in -dev. And if we're running in live, in production mode, then there won't be that -dev there. Now, there are, I think, two ways of doing this. We could probably achieve that requirement using some kind of a pipeline. I think that might get a bit ugly and difficult. Let me explain. We could here in the values.yaml file have a value, something like environment, and we could set this to be prod or dev. Certainly one way of doing it. And then we could grab that value right here after the dash. And instead of using the hard-coded string, we could use the usual structure of using the .values.environment. So that's okay and would sometimes work. Why only sometimes? Well, if we're in dev, then let's try the Helm template. And yeah, that's doing exactly what we need. But the thinking was, if we set the value to prod, then we're running in production. Well, unfortunately, running the template, just to confirm, that is picking up the value, but that's not actually the requirement. The requirement is that the tag just is v1.0.0 if it's production without the -prod. So I suppose we could change our naming scheme of the tags, but I want you to imagine that we're on a project and the tags are already created, that naming scheme, maybe we've used that naming scheme for years and we're stuck with it. So it's not really a simple text substitution that we want to do here. Now, I'm absolutely sure that you could probably come up with some pipelining scheme and call various functions in here. However, we don't need to do that because it is perfectly permissible to use if, then, and else statements. Let's delete what we were trying here. So I've moved things back to where we just have the bare tag v1.0.0, which is what we want if we're in production mode. But if we're in development mode, then we want to append an extra string. I realize I'm kind of at the end of the screen here. I'm just going to temporarily drop the image part onto the next line, and then I'll move it back up shortly. Again, we are in standard Go here, and there is an if statement in Go. Now I'm going to do this not in correct Go syntax at first, so don't be annoyed if you already know Go, but I'm going to say, I'm sort of pseudo-coding here, if in the values.environment, if that value equals the string dev, then, and we don't need a then, we just leave the action block. Outside of the block, we then write in what we want to be rendered if this expression is evaluated to true. If this is evaluated to false, then this string -dev will not be rendered. Because this is now becoming flow control, we do need to end the if. It isn't end if actually, it is the statement end. Actually, I am hard coding this because in Go, there isn't a double equals operator or even a single equals operator. We're back to using functions again. And there is an EQ function. And just as with all other functions in Go, we don't use any round brackets or commas. It's just the name of the function followed by the parameters into that function. So it will take a bit of getting used to if you're not used to this style of syntax. It's called prefix notation. So when we run this through the processor, if the environment is equal to dev, then the following will be rendered. It will remove the actions and we will end up with that as a result. Let's undo that. If this is not equal, then the whole block from the if to the end is not rendered. And that's exactly what we want. So I'll restore this line back to the previous line. I realize that this line 18 is starting to get a little bit long and ugly now. I could probably do some refactoring of this to simplify it down a bit, but I hope it's getting across the idea. Well, let's try it. We'll use in values.yaml. We'll start with the string prod. So we don't want to see that -dev appearing. Back to the command line, and we'll rerun the template command. And it ran, and if we find the image line here, that's looking good. There's no -dev on the end. If we switch this now to dev, then let's run again, and that is looking perfect. That's quite good, I suppose. We could certainly make some improvements here. The obvious improvement I would want to make is that this is clearly a Boolean. It's a true or a false. We could put any random garbage in here and it would still be valid. It would still go through this if statement, and really everything other than dev is going to evaluate to production. So yeah, let's confirm that. We can run Helm template and it is working, and it's sort of defaulting to -prod. Really, we would want an error there because we have an invalid value appearing here. You might be aware in YAML there is the concept of a Boolean. This is evaluating to a string, and technically we really should have quotation marks around it. But if in YAML we use just a single word like we're doing here, then infers that this is a string. We don't have to use a string. We could use a Boolean here. Instead of calling it environment, we could have gone for, let's get rid of that comment. It would have been much more readable, I think, if we just called this field development, and we can set that to true or false. How would that change? Well, then we could still use this in the equals. We would be saying now if values.development is true, we can tidy this up a little bit further in a moment, but if the development is set to true, then we'll append -dev. If it's false, then we won't. Let's save that. So I think this is a little bit more elegant. We don't have to guess what the possible values are in here. Let's see if it works. And remember, at the moment, we are in dev mode. And yes, it is rendering -dev. Let's go into non-dev mode and run again. And wonderful, we now have the production version. And an advantage of this is if there's some other value in here, then that's now become a string. And I don't want to get too deep into Golang here, but that will cause an error here because we're using the word true here. It knows that that's a Boolean and not a string, and we will get a type mismatch here. Let's try it. And yeah, we do incompatible types for comparison. And that's an advantage because it means we are constrained to either using true or false. A bit of syntactic sugar here is that instead of true, you can also use yes, and you can use no for false. Let's check that. So we have development yes, and we have -dev, development no, and we have production. Fantastic. Another final piece of syntax sugar here is that, just as in any other programming language, when you're working with a Boolean, you don't need to test if a particular value is true or false. You can simply, and we can lose the equals now, that was needed when we were working with an arbitrary string, and we can lose the true. Because development is a Boolean, this is now automatic, and that works because this development value is now a Boolean. So this is going to evaluate to if true and if false, if the value you're working with is already a Boolean. So I think that looks a little bit neater and it's more readable. You can probably also guess that we can use an else as well. Now, we don't have a requirement for this here, but if it were the case that in development we tag the images we have on the tag -dev, if in production we were to have a tag ending in -prod, then we could capture that using an else statement, and it looks like this. We would embed a further action in here of else, and then between the else and the end, we put in the alternative version if this expression is evaluated to false. So for us, that's going to be -prod. I won't bother testing that. I promise you it does work, and try it for yourself if you want to test that. But just to keep on track with this practical, remember we don't have a requirement for that. So I'm going to remove that else block so that we have nothing rendered there if we're in production. There's just one major construct we need to look at now in Helm templates, and that's how to use subtemplates. It's not as bad as it sounds. We'll leave that for the next video.